There is a moment in every royal marriage when the fairy tale ends and the institution begins. For King Charles III and Queen Camilla, that moment did not arrive with a crown or a ceremony. It arrived quietly, behind closed doors, in the form of a list. Names that would not be read aloud, chairs that would not be filled, hands that would never be shaken inside Buckingham Palace. The silence that followed was not accidental. It was policy. To understand what happened, you have to go back further than most people are willing to go. Camilla Rosemary Shand was not born into royalty. She was born into the English upper class, comfortable, connected, and entirely accustomed to moving through rooms where power lived without ever holding it herself. Her father, Major Bruce Shand, was a decorated war veteran and wine merchant. Her mother, Rosalind, came from a family that valued appearance, composure, and the quiet maintenance of reputation above almost everything else. They were good people, by most accounts. Solid, respectable. The kind of family that knew which fork to use and which questions not to ask. But respectable and royal are two entirely different countries, and the distance between them is measured not in miles, but in bloodlines, in centuries, in a kind of inherited institutional suspicion that never fully disappears. When Charles and Camilla first met in the early 1970s, and she was everything the palace was not. She was warm where the institution was cold. She was funny where protocol demanded gravity. She laughed easily and spoke plainly. And Charles, a man who had been raised inside a machine designed to suppress exactly those qualities, fell for her in a way that his family found alarming rather than romantic. They were separated. The palace maneuvered. Charles was sent away on naval duty, and when he returned, Camilla had married Andrew Parker Bowles, and the institution had done what institutions do. It had protected itself. What followed was 3 decades of one of the most scrutinized, criticized, and complicated relationships in modern royal history. The affair, the taped phone calls, the Diana years, the public fury, the divorce, the slow, painful rehabilitation of Camilla's image from villain to accepted presence to finally, queen consort. By the time Charles became king in September 2022, Camilla had spent the better part of 20 years proving herself to the British public, to the press, and most of all to the palace machine itself. She had been patient in a way that would have destroyed a lesser person. She had absorbed the hatred of an entire nation that loved Diana, and she had not cracked. She had shown up, smiled, worked, and waited. And yet, the moment Charles assumed the throne, and something shifted in a way that even those closest to the royal family did not fully anticipate. Power changes people, yes. But more than that, power reveals the boundaries that sentiment had previously obscured. Charles was no longer a prince trying to legitimize a love affair. He was a king, and kings operate according to different rules, rules older than any individual, rules that do not care about love stories. The trouble with Camilla's family was not that they were bad people. By all accounts, they were perfectly pleasant. Her son, Tom Parker Bowles, is a food writer of some repute. Her daughter, Laura Lopes, moves through the social world with easy grace. Her relatives, the extended Shand network, the Parker Bowles connections, the various cousins and in-laws who had, over the years, become loosely attached to the idea of royal adjacency. None of them had done anything scandalous. Nothing that would have drawn the kind of institutional alarm bells that palace security teams respond to. The problem was simpler and more brutal than scandal. They were not considered royal enough. This was the quiet calculation that began almost immediately after the accession. Charles, who had spent his entire adult life fighting the institution on behalf of his own emotional life, found himself, once inside the institution's highest office, and enforcing its logic with a precision that surprised even his closest advisors. The palace began drawing a careful, deliberate line around who would receive formal recognition, who would be invited to key ceremonies, who would be granted the kind of proximity to the crown that carries weight in both social and political terms. Camilla's relatives found themselves on the wrong side of that line. It did not happen in one dramatic confrontation. There was no shouting, no single letter of refusal, or no moment where someone slammed a door and declared the matter settled. That is not how the palace works. The palace works through omission, through unreturned calls from equerries, through invitation lists that are simply never extended, through the gentle, suffocating weight of being made to understand, without anyone ever quite saying it, that you are not included, and the shunned relatives, particularly those on the more peripheral branches of Camilla's family tree, began noticing it in small ways first. Events they might have expected to attend, where their presence would have been natural given the new queen's position, passed without any communication from the palace. Formal occasions where a nod to Camilla's family heritage might have seemed fitting produced nothing but institutional silence. Some of them waited, assuming it was an oversight. A new reign is a complicated thing. There are 1,000 details to manage, 1,000 traditions to navigate, and perhaps the invitations had simply been lost in the machinery of transition. They were not lost. Inside the palace, the decision about Camilla's relatives had been made with the kind of cold clarity that only institutions with centuries of practice can achieve. Charles had drawn a distinction, one that he believed was both necessary and correct, between Camilla herself, who had been elevated and legitimized and crowned, and Camilla's family, who had not. The queen's position was secure. Her relative's position was not his concern. What made this particularly complicated was that Camilla had never asked for her family to be elevated. She was not the kind of woman who pushed, who lobbied, who made demands. She had spent too long learning the hard way that demands made to the palace machine tend to produce the opposite of the intended result. She had achieved what she achieved through patience and endurance, not through pressure. But she noticed. She noticed the absences. She noticed the silence from people she knew had reached out. She noticed the way certain family members spoke to her now with a slightly forced brightness, the kind that people use when they are pretending something doesn't sting. She said nothing, not publicly, not in any way that would later be quoted or sourced or turned into a headline. But the palace felt it. There is a particular kind of tension that settles into a royal household when the person at its center is unhappy in a way they refuse to name. It changes the atmosphere. It makes equerries careful. It makes private secretaries precise in ways they normally wouldn't be. It spreads through the staff the way cold spreads through an old building. You can't see it, but you feel it in every room. The silence that followed Charles's decision was not the comfortable silence of a settled matter. It was the silence of something that had been set in motion and not yet finished moving. The palace has always been better at maintaining silence than the people inside it. That is the central paradox of royal life. The institution endures precisely because it never explains itself, never defends itself, never dignifies a rumor with a denial. Silence is not a failure of communication inside those walls. It is the primary language, and for decades, almost everyone who entered the orbit of the crown eventually learned to speak it. Camilla had learned it better than most. But her family had not grown up inside that system. They had grown up in the normal world, where silence means something has gone wrong, where being ignored is an insult rather than a strategy, where the absence of an invitation is not a carefully considered institutional decision, but simply a sign that you are not wanted. The distinction matters enormously, and it was the source of almost everything that would follow. By the spring of 2023, the situation had moved from atmosphere to something more concrete. Sources close to the extended Parker Bowles family, not the immediate children who were savvy enough to stay quiet, began speaking carefully, obliquely, and to journalists who knew how to listen. Nothing on the record. Nothing that could be traced back with precision. But the shape of the story began to emerge in the press the way shapes emerge in fog, not suddenly visible, but gradually, unmistakably there. The narrative was careful and sympathetic. Camilla's relatives, the story went, had expected a natural elevation of their family's position following the accession, not titles, not formal roles, but inclusion, recognition, and the kind of quiet acknowledgement that says, you are connected to the crown, and the crown sees that. What they received instead was the institutional equivalent of a closed door with no explanation. The press, sensing the tension, began asking questions that had no official answers. Palace spokespeople, trained to deflect with the precision of Olympic athletes, said nothing useful. Charles's office issued no statements. Camilla's office issued no statements. The silence held, officially, perfectly, in the way that palace silences always hold, until they don't. What complicated things further was the timing. The coronation had taken place in May 2023, and the imagery of that ceremony, the crown, the anointing, Camilla kneeling and then rising as queen, had been in many ways the final act of a very long public rehabilitation. The British public had largely, if not entirely, made their peace with her. The tabloids that had once savaged her now ran respectful profiles. And the women who had burned her effigy outside palaces in the Diana years were quieter now, older, or simply exhausted by the weight of a grudge held for 3 decades. Camilla had won the public, and it had cost her everything it had cost her. To have that triumph shadowed, even privately, by tension within her own family, that was a particular cruelty that the coronation photographers did not capture. The question people closest to the situation kept returning to was this: why had Charles drawn the line where he did? The answer, as best as those who understood the palace could reconstruct it, was layered in a way that defied simple telling. Part of it was precedent. The British monarchy has always been deeply cautious about the proliferation of royal-adjacent status. The history of the crown is littered with the damage done by extended family members who assumed that proximity to power entitled them to its benefits, and who behaved accordingly in ways that created scandal, expense, and embarrassment. Charles had watched this pattern play out across his own family with painful specificity. He had seen what happened when the circle of royal consideration expanded beyond its carefully maintained borders. He had no interest in repeating those mistakes. And part of it was the particular shape of his relationship with Camilla herself. For all its warmth, for all its depth, it had always been a relationship conducted inside a structure of enormous external pressure. He had protected it, fought for it, waited for it across 30 years of separation and reunion and public horror. And in doing so, he had perhaps developed a habit of thinking about it in terms of the two of them, not in terms of the families attached to each of them. Camilla was his. That was the thing he had always been certain of. Her relatives were a separate matter entirely. And part of it, the part that was hardest to speak aloud but was perhaps the most honest, was that Charles had spent his entire life as the product of an institution that measured worth in bloodlines, and some part of him, the part that had been shaped by that institution from the moment he was born, could not fully overcome it. His own family had not considered Camilla worthy for decades, and he had fought that judgment. He had won against it, but in winning, he had not dismantled the framework that produced the judgment. He had simply overridden it in one specific case. Camilla's relatives had not been granted that override. Inside the palace, there were people who believed Charles had made a mistake, not a moral one, but a strategic one. A king who had spent so much political capital humanizing his marriage, who had worked so carefully to present Camilla as a full partner in the work of the crown, was now drawing a line that seemed to contradict the spirit of everything he had built. If Camilla was truly queen, not in name only, not as a concession, but as a real partner to the king, Then, the systematic exclusion of her family communicated something that Charles had not intended to communicate. It communicated that her elevation was permitted but not complete, but that she was accepted but not fully absorbed, that the door had been opened and she had walked through it, but her family was required to remain on the other side. Camilla felt it. She continued to perform her duties with the same composed efficiency that had carried her through everything else. She attended the engagements. She gave the speeches. She smiled at the right moments and was solemn at the right moments and never once gave the press an opening. She was, by any external measure, the perfect modern queen. But people who knew her well, not the palace staff, not the equerries, but the older friends, the ones from before all of this, the ones who had known her when she was just Camilla Shand from a good family who had fallen for the wrong man at the wrong time. Those people noticed a change, not in her manner, not in her public face, in her eyes. There is a specific kind of grief that belongs to people who have worked very hard for something and then found, like upon receiving it, that it came with a cost they hadn't been told about in advance. It is quieter than ordinary grief, more contained. It doesn't weep, it doesn't rage, it simply settles like sediment in still water and changes the quality of everything above it. Camilla wore that grief with the same practiced composure she wore everything else. And Charles, who loved her in the complicated, imperfect, wholly real way that people love each other after 3 decades of difficulty, saw it. And he had caused it. And he had caused it not through cruelty or indifference, but through the same institutional logic that had once tried to keep them apart, the logic he had fought so hard and won against, and then, without quite meaning to, reproduced in a different form. The palace machine had shaped him, and he had shaped it, and somewhere in that mutual shaping, Camilla's family had become the price of the peace. But whether he understood the full weight of that price, whether anyone inside those walls truly understood it, was the question that hung in the air of the palace, unanswered in the months that followed. The silence held. But silence, in the end, is never actually empty. It is always full of the things that haven't been said yet. Every institution eventually meets the thing it cannot absorb. For the British monarchy, that thing has always been human emotion. The crown can survive scandal. It has survived abdications, affairs, divorces, deaths broadcast live to a grieving nation. It has survived the fury of the people and the collapse of its own mythology more times than any history book fully captures. What it struggles with, what it has always struggled with, is the small, private, entirely human cost of the machinery it runs. The machinery runs on exclusion. It always has. But exclusion leaves marks on the people it touches. And those people do not always stay quiet forever. By late 2023, the story of Camilla's relatives and their complicated relationship to the new reign had developed a life of its own in the way that palace stories always do, not through official channels, not through press conferences or statements, but through the accumulation of small details, observed by many people, reported by few, believed by almost everyone who understood how these things work. What emerged was not a single dramatic confrontation, but a pattern. A consistent, documented pattern of Camilla's family being kept at a careful distance from the formal structures of royal life in a way that, viewed individually, could always be explained away, but viewed together, told a clear story. Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son, was perhaps the most visible data point. He moved comfortably in public life. His food-writing career was established, and his social presence was easy and well-managed, but there was a notable absence of any formal royal role or recognition that might have been expected given his mother's position. He attended events as a private citizen. He was not consulted on matters where his connection to the Queen might have made his involvement natural. He remained, in the eyes of the palace, Camilla's son rather than the king's stepson, a distinction that was never stated and never needed to be. It's because it was made plain through every interaction and non-interaction the institution produced. Laura Lopes, his sister, navigated the same invisible line with the same outward composure. Both of them, trained by decades of watching their mother manage impossible situations with grace, understood the game well enough not to play it badly in public. But understanding the game does not mean you are unaffected by it. And the Parker Bowles children had spent their childhoods watching their mother be treated as a problem, a scandal, a third party in a marriage that the whole world had an opinion about. They had watched her persevere through things that would have ended most people. They had watched her earn, slowly and at enormous personal cost, a position that the institution had once seemed designed to deny her forever. And now they were watching the institution, in its quiet and efficient way, to draw a new line that left them on the outside of it. The line was different from the one that had once excluded their mother. It was not hostile. It was not driven by the kind of public fury that had defined the Diana years. It was simply institutional, bloodless. The way a door that has never been opened is different from a door that has been slammed in your face, but both have the same result. They were outside. What made this dynamic particularly resonant was the broader context in which it was playing out. The monarchy in 2023 was not the monarchy of 30 years earlier. It was a smaller, more scrutinized institution, operating under pressure from multiple directions, from a public that was increasingly skeptical of inherited privilege, from a press that had grown more aggressive, from younger generations within the royal family itself, who had begun, however tentatively, and to push back against the rigidity of the old ways. Charles had come to the throne with a stated intention to modernize. He had talked in the years before his accession about a slimmed-down monarchy, fewer working royals, more focused engagement, a leaner institution that justified itself through service rather than spectacle. This was not a radical position. It was in many ways a sensible response to the pressures the monarchy faced. But modernization, as Charles was discovering, it is easier to declare than to implement without contradiction. Because the decision to exclude Camilla's relatives was not modern. It was not the act of a reformed institution moving forward. It was the act of a very old institution protecting a very old idea, that the bloodline matters, that the circle must be kept tight, that elevation is personal and finite, and does not travel sideways through the families of the elevated. It was the same logic that had once told a young Charles that Camilla Shand was not suitable. He had refused that logic for himself. He had not, it turned out, fully refused it. The people inside the palace who noticed this contradiction were careful about saying so aloud. Palace staff do not survive long if they make a habit of pointing out the king's blind spots, but in the careful, an oblique way that palace insiders have always communicated. Through strategic briefings to trusted journalists, through the placement of small suggestive details in otherwise innocuous stories, through the management of narrative rather than its direct production, the shape of the tension became visible to those who knew how to look. And then, in the way that these things always happen, someone spoke too plainly. The specific channel through which the story fully broke into public consciousness was, characteristically, not a direct statement, but an interpretation. A columnist who had spent years covering the palace, reading the available evidence and writing, with more directness than was typical, that the king's treatment of his wife's family represented a failure not of policy, but of character. That a man who had built his public case for his marriage on the argument that love deserved to be respected was now deploying precisely the same institutional coldness against Camilla's relatives that had once been deployed against Camilla herself. The column was discussed. It was argued over. It was denied by palace sources in the careful, technically accurate, but broadly misleading way that palace sources always deny things. It was not wrong. Camilla, for her part, I did what she had always done. She continued. She showed up. She performed the role with the full commitment of someone who understood that the role was larger than any individual grievance, however real and however personal that grievance might be. But something had been said now that could not be unsaid, and the question of what the monarchy owes the families of those it elevates, of whether acceptance is truly acceptance if it does not extend beyond the individual, had been placed on the table in a way that could not be tidily removed. Charles was, by all serious accounts, a man of genuine thoughtfulness and genuine care. The caricature of him as cold or indifferent has always been an oversimplification of a far more complicated person, a man shaped by extraordinary pressure into extraordinary restraint, who had, across his long life, done both admirable and regrettable things in roughly the same proportion as most people who have ever had to navigate impossible circumstances. He was not a villain in this story. Neither was the institution exactly. Institutions do not have intentions. They have logic. They have patterns. They have centuries of self-preservation encoded into every decision they produce, and those decisions do not feel cruel from the inside because they are not personal. They are simply operational. The cruelty, to the extent that it exists, is structural. And structural cruelty is the hardest kind to address because there is no individual to blame, no single decision to reverse, no door to open that will fix everything. There is only the slow, difficult work of recognizing that the structure itself needs to change, and the even slower, more difficult work of being willing to be the person who changes it. Charles stood at that crossroads in the quiet months that followed. The public pressure was manageable. The press attention would cycle on, as it always did, to the next story, the next crisis, the next piece of royal theater that the nation consumed with its strange mixture of affection and contempt. And what could not be managed as easily was Camilla. Not her behavior. She was, as always, impeccable. But her awareness. The awareness of a woman who had survived 30 years of being the problem and had finally, at the cost of everything, become something else, only to find that the institution's appetite for exclusion was not satisfied by her own elevation. It had simply found new people to exclude. She knew. She had always known how to survive knowing things without acting on them in ways that could be used against her. She had learned that in the hardest possible school, across the hardest possible years, under a scrutiny that would have broken most people entirely. She survived this too. The palace doors remained what they had always been, beautiful, heavy, and open to exactly the people the institution had decided, according to its own ancient arithmetic, deserved to enter. Everyone else stood in the cold outside, and the crown moved forward, as the crown always has, carrying its brilliance and its damage together, inseparable, through whatever came next.